get started. I do appreciate everyone being here and taking the time this afternoon to listen to some of what we have to say about mycotoxins. So, to start off, I just wanted to give a brief introduction, and I hope you all can see this okay. And just to give a brief introduction and to remind you all to pop your questions in the chat if you have any throughout the presentation, and we'll get to those in a short Q&A session at the end of the presentation. But anyway, my name Aaliyah Gelati. I am a poultry product specialist here with Ralco. I've been here about a little over 2 years. So I will let Tim introduce himself now if he is on.
Good afternoon. My name is Tim Broderick. I'm the Poultry Technical Manager here at Ralco, and I've been with Ralco for the last 5 years.
Awesome. So intros out of the way, just to give you all a brief overview, if you're not familiar with Ralco and what we do here, I wanted to kind of introduce us to you. We are a technology company and we do grow a lot through our key partners. We really pride ourselves in the use of natural alternatives to improve animal health and performance, whether that be essential oils, prebiotic fibers. We also do some work in other species and agronomy as well. And we're not just limited to our health additives and health products. We also work in premixes and diet formulations, focusing on maximizing the energy and nutrient utilization of those diets. And we do also manufacture all of our products in Marshall, Minnesota, which makes us somewhat unique. All of our stuff is manufactured here in the US. And we also do have a technical innovation team that is led by a vast majority of PhDs and biochemical engineers. And with that team, we have developed and currently hold about 20 patents. I think we're a little over that now. And we have an additional 38 currently pending. So just a quick overview of the image in Ralco. That is our on-site or poultry research barn that we have out in Minnesota that we do some of our poultry research at. So getting into more of the meat and potatoes of this presentation, some of the topics we're going to cover include just a general overview of understanding mycotoxins, what they are, what they do, the importance of mycotoxin testing and some of your testing options, mycotoxin impacts in the poultry industry specifically, and then some management strategies for mycotoxins. And then we will discuss briefly our mycotoxin solution here at Ralco and go over some of the observations we've seen and the research that we have behind that product and in comparison to some other common binders that you'll see in the industry. So first, just understanding mycotoxins in poultry, what they are. Mycotoxins are secondary metabolites of mold or fungi, and similarly, antibiotics are secondary metabolites of mold, but they're not toxic to the animal. The mycotoxins are those toxic metabolites that can harm the animal or cause production loss and health challenges. And specifically, some of the mycotoxins that are of concern in poultry are going to be your aflatoxins, your DON, vomitoxins, ochratoxin A, T2 toxin, and zearalenone. So how some of these originate, they can come from the field, they can develop at the mill, or even at the farm level. And some of the causes of this in the field mainly, include weather conditions leading to ear rot, moisture, inconsistent, environmental temperatures, rainfall, and dry spells. They can develop in storage, whether that be in bags or in bins. That's why it's important to make sure bins are properly managed because we can get mycotoxin development in bins. And even out in the field in terms of hay, I know this is a poultry discussion, but looking at hay bales specifically in the image on the bottom right, if not properly managed and treated, we can also see mold and mycotoxins form in these hay bale or hay storage in general. And then lastly, we can see it at the farm level, such as in feeders. If we get some moisture buildup, you can get some feed caked in that feeder, and it can form molds and mycotoxins in the feeders themselves. So that's why it's important to also keep in mind, on farm management when we're looking at a mycotoxin challenge. So looking at some of the specific levels, the cautionary levels in poultry, obviously they differ between toxins, but I wanted to use this visual to kind of point out the difference between different phases of the bird's life. So different ages, or if they are a breeding stock, they might have different sensitivities to a specific toxin, such as aflatoxin, where you have layers with a cautionary level of 10 parts per billion, while a starter may only, be able to reasonably deal with 5. And this also does vary between species. For example, turkeys have a higher sensitivity to aflatoxin than broilers. And we did also want to address the kind of trends that we've seen with mycotoxins in the past in terms of prevalence. This is a graph that shows some data from the DSM monthly mycotoxin survey on U.S. corn. The green bar up at the top is going to be the percentage of positive samples, so samples of corn that are testing positive for mycotoxins. And then the yellow bar is going to represent the samples of corn that were tested to be, have found multiple mycotoxins within the same sample. And as you can see, we're at a 5-year high with just overall mycotoxin positive samples. And we're pretty high in samples that are containing more than one mycotoxin, which kind of comes into play when we talk about confounding effects, which we'll get to a little bit later. But it's important to remember that although, we're seeing the levels of mycotoxins rise, what specific mycotoxins are we seeing that are high? And that's when we pulled some of the DSM data for specific mycotoxins. And this is showing a pretty stable trend overall, with a couple of exceptions, but we're still seeing the fumonisin, the DON, and the zearalenone as those, top 3 mycotoxins of concern that are found in most samples. But keeping in mind that also T2, aflatoxin, and ochratoxin A, while low, can still be prevalent, and it doesn't mean that they're not there. It just means that maybe we're not getting samples in from the geographical locations that these toxins are present in. So again, we're seeing, a slight increase in fumonisin in 2025 from the year prior, but overall fumonisin has been pretty stable and very high. So DSM obviously is a great resource for mycotoxin testing, but I did want to show you all the mycotoxin testing service that we have, and it can be pretty well described in this video. So I'm going to play this really quick for you all.
Mycotoxins are one of the most overlooked threats in livestock and poultry production, and they can be present in feed ingredients long before you see any signs in your animals and birds. That's why Ralco offers mycotoxin testing for feed and ingredient samples. If you're concerned about contamination or simply want certainty about what you're feeding, our lab can give you clear, accurate answers. Mycotoxin levels can vary widely as grain moves across regions, creating hidden hotspots in stored grain that can skew results and pose hidden threats. Even at low levels, mycotoxins can reduce feed intake and weaken immunity. Testing can help catch these risks before they negatively impact performance. Our team uses validated testing methods to detect the presence and concentration of the most common and most damaging mycotoxins found in livestock and poultry diets. Here's how our testing program works. Test your ingredients, review results with Ralco experts, get a mycotoxin plan for your operation. Ralco's animal nutritionists can help you interpret your mycotoxin results and recommend practical strategies to protect livestock and poultry. Get started today by calling 1-800-533-5306 to talk to a Ralco representative.
Right, so that just was an overview, and I wanted to include that to emphasize the importance of mycotoxin testing. Not only does it help you get a view into what's going on at your facility, or maybe, what kind of grains are you pulling in, specifically corn and DGGs. But it also helps the industry build out a bigger picture and a more complete picture of what trends are regionally, what mycotoxins might come to expect, so you can plan better for that. And I'm now going to pass along to Tim to address some of the concerns on the bird level.
Thanks, Aaliyah. So when we look at mycotoxins in the field, first thing is what exactly are they? And Aaliyah did a good job of describing them as secondary metabolites that are really from usually contaminated corn and mold that develops on that corn. But why do they really appear and how do they affect the animal? One, they're toxins, so to some degree they're going to be ending up causing damage. But when they appear on that kernel of corn, the molds are secreting these secondary metabolites to try and break down the kernels around them so they can utilize nutrients, to try and deal with different stresses on that corn, and to be able to persist in that environment, outcompete other microorganisms. And that's great for the mold, which is trying to, again, persist on this sample of corn. But when we start taking those properties and applying it to poultry, we start seeing it have a lot of those damaging effects. So instead of breaking apart the outside germ of a piece of corn, it's now degrading into the liver. And we start seeing gizzard lesions associated with DON or T2, or even oral and dermal lesions with aflatoxin B1, HT2, and others. When we start looking at that oxidative stress where the mold is secreting these different mycotoxins to deal with their own oxidative balance in the bird, that's creating oxidative stress. And so we're starting to see symptoms such as the decreased performance, increased oxidative stress within that bird, oxidative rancidity in fats, etc. And it's these different factors that start working within the bird to ultimately impair health. So when we start looking at what those lesions actually look like, we can actually have visual symptoms, everything from oral lesions to liver lesions, as those metabolites are filtered from the blood by the liver, but leave residual damage. For things like aflatoxicosis, or fusarium toxins, for example, you can get that gizzard erosion where you're going to see differences in the musculature and thickness of that gizzard, and ultimately have that inside layer that kind of peels away, breaks, or degrades. And so when we look at performance and what it actually has in terms of performance loss within the animal, we're often looking at the performance of that flock, degraded growth rates, depressed feed conversion ratios, and poor egg production in any type of laying flock. But it's also the visible damage that we can see to confirm some of these significant challenges. So when we look at what that actually looks like on a performance side, we looked at a subset of main effects data from some of the research that we've done here at Ralco. And what we really see is mycotoxin challenge ultimately reduces both production and efficiency. So these graphs have body weight as green bars and feed conversion represented by the right y-axis as yellow checkered bars. And we see two different statuses of mycotoxin exposure. And this exposure was done with low levels of multiple different toxins, which is what we most commonly see in the field. On the left of each graph, we have unchallenged group, body weight and feed conversion, and then the group that was fed corn and feed contaminated with these secondary metabolites and mycotoxins as the challenged group. And we see the most drastic difference in the starter phase, where we see a slight decrease in body weight, but a significant difference of feed conversion at over 10 points. In the overall performance, those differences do very kind of start to narrow with this low level continued exposure. But at the same time, our ultimate cost to the production side for these broilers was about 2.5 to 3 points of feed conversion ratio, as well as a little over 100 to 120 grams of body weight difference. And that's significant when we talk about the ultimate productivity and profitability of a flock.
I just realized I was muted. My apologies. Building off of that, we're just going to go over some best practices of, how do we prevent all of these negative effects to the bird at either the farm level or at the feed mill or in the field. And it kind of starts off, the first thing I wanted to point out was storage. We don't often think about storage as an issue, but when we're talking about mycotoxin control, looking at things like moisture, airflow, temperature, sanitation of the bins, because as you can see in the top left corner, these bins can get built up and moisture trapped, and you can, like I said, with the feeders, get caked material that can develop mold, fungus, and then produce mycotoxins from there. So making sure we're keeping these bins clean and sanitized, because mechanical cleaning doesn't always remove the cause of the issue. So making sure not only are we cleaning, but we're sanitizing as well. And also looking at things such as rodent control and insect control. Rodents and insects can be vectors of all sorts of challenges, and making sure that we're not providing them an outlet to get into, our storage. Our grain storage is going to be super important when we're talking about mycotoxins and other disease challenges. And then first in, first out management is another thing, making sure that we're using the corn or the DDGs or whatever type of grain that you bring in first. We're also using that first. So we're not storing it for prolonged periods of time, which is going to increase your risk of mycotoxins inherently. And kind of off of that point, looking at grain rotation. What is your bin rotation like? Are we limiting the carryover? What are our blending practices like? Are we keeping them, pretty tight and managed well? And similarly, the ingredients themselves, sourcing them. Are you looking at suppliers that are reputable? They have a good reputation in the industry for providing high quality grains. Are they giving you the paperwork that you require? Making sure that we're tracking regional risks. For example, you have a higher risk of aflatoxins and vomitoxins if you're acquiring grain from somewhere that was grown and stored in a hot and dry environment, whereas cool and wet environments pose a higher risk for vomitoxin or DON, T2, HT2, zearalenone, ochratoxin A. So from that, you can kind of, a management practice that might work for you is diversifying your sources, diversifying where you're getting these grains. At the bottom right, you can see a couple of graphs that just show how different the contamination levels of certain toxins can be, even between states that are right beside each other. So, for example, Tennessee and Kentucky with zearalenone, we see Tennessee having a much higher contamination rate of zearalenone than Kentucky, and they're right beside each other. So, if you're bringing in, grain from a state that may have a very high risk of a certain mycotoxin, maybe diversifying and sourcing some grain from elsewhere that has historically, not had as much of a risk of that mycotoxin, and just making sure that we're limiting as much risk as we can. And then to kind of further limit that risk, it's testing. Test your feed. It's important to not only test the ingredients, but also your finished feed. Because at the end of the day, even just one little hot spot in your grain or in that feed can lead to a much bigger challenge, especially if you consider, you have a hot spot that comes in with a truck of corn, for example, and you're grinding it up, you're processing it, and mycotoxins are pretty heat sensitive, so they can survive processing temperatures for the most part. And what was once, a small isolated issue is now spread throughout that entire batch of grain that can lead to bigger issues. So this, also kind of plays into what I mentioned earlier, looking at multiple different mycotoxins, making sure that you're testing for multiple mycotoxins, because as the DSM data showed us, we can have, it is more common than not to have a sample of corn at least, come back and test positive for multiple mycotoxins. So making sure that when we're testing, we're not just testing for the kind of mycotoxin of biggest concern, but we're testing a broad spectrum to make sure that we're getting all of the information, because even at low levels, especially when there are multiple mycotoxins present in the same environment, that can have confounding or synergistic effects on each other that can further harm the bird. And not only does this data help us kind of make decisions, but monitoring this data over time can help you see trends and base decisions off of those trends, and overall help you to manage your risk a little bit better. And the next thing I wanted to point out here was with formulation controls. Looking at our diets and your formulations, a lot of you may be adding a mycotoxin binder to your feed, but it's important to look past that and beyond that and to consider other additives such as antioxidants, vitamin E. Some feed additives or vitamins and minerals, nutritional additives for your feed can help mitigate some of the negative effects that mycotoxins have on the bird. So even if you do have a mycotoxin challenge, which is fairly common, these certain additives can help mitigate that beyond just having a binder in that feed. And then lastly, your own farm feed management and documentation of training of staff. Looking at the bin and feeder management, limiting prolonged storage, like I mentioned, and doing frequent inspections. It's not only important to inspect incoming loads of corn and finished feed, it's also important to routinely test the grains that you have in storage. Because like I said, they can develop in that storage environment, especially if the conditions are right. And oftentimes that can go unlooked, especially if you can see the bottom left-hand corner. The two red triangles in the corners are a spot where typically there's a lot of buildup. The grain is flowing down and forming kind of an inverse or concave cone. And a lot of the times, once you get to the bottom of that bin, you're missing what's in those corners. And that can lead to further, complications and mycotoxin risk, especially if you're not cleaning those bins out thoroughly. And then I mentioned, training, making sure your staff are trained to do these sampling procedures, making sure that you have programs in place, such as HACCP, to help you with these trainings, and these, management practices can really go a long way. So the use of these toxin binders, like I mentioned, why are they important? And to my earlier point, they're pretty unavoidable, and they are heat stable. They can survive high temperatures in the feed manufacturing process, and they can impact, like Tim mentioned, bird health in general, immune function, gut nutrient absorption, and just overall performance. So looking at the different modes of action that these mycotoxin binders can use is also beneficial when you're considering which mycotoxin binder you want to use. So some of the modes of action include absorption, which is the binding for excretion; transformation, which is where you have enzymes converting these toxins into a less toxic form; antioxidants, such as your vitamin E that I mentioned, but in this case, a specific mode of action of a toxin binder supporting the detoxification of those toxins and reducing the secondary effects of exposure. And then lastly, just protection in reducing the intestinal damage that mycotoxins can bring, as well as oxidative stress and inflammation. So a couple of types of mycotoxin binders we commonly see in the industry are going to be your clays, your yeast cell wall derivatives, and enzymes. With clays, these are, things such as your bentonite clays, HSCAS, and their mode of action is absorption. And while they have a relatively limited spectrum of coverage, and that means, how many mycotoxins are they effective against, although it is limited, they have an extremely high efficiency for binding aflatoxins. Additionally, they are very cost effective and pretty stable. And some of the limitations that may, deter you, or depending on your goals, could be the inconsistent or limited binding of fusarium toxins. If that's what you're struggling with, maybe clays aren't the way to go. But if you have aflatoxin, maybe they are. They can also bind up key nutrients in the feed, so preventing that bird from uptaking and absorbing those nutrients for further, production. If you do have a mycotoxin present, you want that bird to be utilizing every single thing in that diet and that when bound up by one of these binders can affect the bird's health further, which is not ideal. And also the effectiveness of these clays can vary based on the purity and structure. So making sure you're getting a quality clay product is important. And then for the yeast cell wall derivatives, these are your mannan-oligosaccharides, beta-glucans, and things like that. Their mode of action is also adsorption mainly, but they do have a secondary benefit, which is going to be some protection of that gut. And they do have a pretty moderate spectrum of coverage, especially when we're looking at DON, T2, zearalenone, and ochratoxin A. They also offer, gut integrity benefits as well as immune system benefits. And they do have a lower risk of binding those key nutrients in the diet and in the formulations than the clays do. But their binding capacity also does depend on the strain of yeast that's used and the method of the processing that it undergoes. And they are less effective against aflatoxins than clays. And then enzymes for the last one, the spectrum of coverage of enzymes is moderate. They're, an example of this is going to be fumazyme. And the mode of action of these is going to be your degradation or transformation of mycotoxins into a less toxic form. They do have a very strong targeted activity against specific mycotoxins, but depending on the enzyme, you can have a limited spectrum of activity. And sometimes these can be much less cost effective than, say, your clays, depending on, again, what enzyme you choose to use. So with all of that being said, I'm going to dive into our solution. And I want to play this video for you all. Again, it's just a short little video, but it describes our product, kind of how it works, why it's important.
IntegraFlo is a cutting-edge feed additive designed for use during times of feed quality concerns. It includes a blend of vitamins and minerals to support your nutrition program. IntegraFlo helps undesirable substances pass harmlessly through the digestive system, restore vital nutrients, and maintain health during times of challenge. Mycotoxins can have a devastating impact on poultry health, reducing feed intake, weight gain, and efficiency. To make matters worse, hot spots of contaminated grain can often go undetected, evading detection in routine tests and increasing the risk to a flock. These dangers are further promoted by factors like wet corn, visible mold, old feed, or using the last grains from a storage bin. IntegraFlo helps mitigate these challenges. IntegraFlo's proprietary blend combines special silicates that effectively absorb harmful substances. With its unique molecular structure, IntegraFlo ensures essential nutrients like phosphorus, amino acids, and trace minerals remain bioavailable. Research shows IntegraFlo outperforms competitors by binding mycotoxins like aflatoxin, zearalenone, ochratoxin A and DON, vomitoxin, across varying pH levels. Key research findings include 100% binding efficiency for aflatoxin, 60 to 80% efficiency for zearalenone, and superior binding for ochratoxin A and DON at higher inclusion rates. IntegraFlo is versatile and easy to use for any toxin level. Low challenge, 2 pounds per ton of feed. Moderate challenge, 4 pounds per ton. Severe challenge, 6 to 8 pounds per ton. IntegraFlo is available in convenient 50-pound bags, including an OMRI-listed version for organic operations. Ralco also provides in-house mycotoxin testing for most raw commodities, not complete feed, to give you confidence in your feed quality. We test for aflatoxin, T2HT2, zearalenone, DON, and vomitoxin. Need results quickly? It's a simple process. Coordinate with your Ralco representative, submit a labeled 100-gram sample to our lab specifying the test you need done. Results are typically delivered within 24 to 48 hours. Don't wait until your birds are showing signs of challenges to take action. IntegraFlo can be used proactively when weather conditions or reports indicate a feed quality risk. By acting early, you protect your flock before problems arise. IntegraFlo. your reliable partner in feed quality management. At Ralco, we create powerful natural tools to tackle agriculture's toughest challenges. That means bringing nature and science together to design products that keep livestock and poultry healthy and producers ahead of the game. With over 50 years of experience, we are your trusted partner in natural animal health and nutrition.
All right, so with that video, it pretty much covers all of the information on this slide, but if you wanted to pause and read, you can, or take a screenshot, just highlighting the structure of IntegraFlo and some of the benefits of the product. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tim, and he's going to go over some of the research that we have behind IntegraFlo and some of the benefits that we've seen.
Thanks, Aaliyah. So when we talk about the actual nuts and bolts of a mycotoxin mitigation program, it's really going to be a myriad of factors that dictate what the true rate is. And so it's combining some of those intervention strategies and risk evaluation measures that Aaliyah talked about prior. That means testing, understanding what your current risk level is for incoming corn or regional risk from corn that you're sourcing. For some of those that are outside of the United States, that means understanding what supply. We have some customers that are blending imported corn and domestic corn. In the US, what region's coming in? Are you getting it trucked in locally, or is it coming on rail? And do you have a good sense of what region that's coming from? So that's going to kind of help determine what your current risk is. It then gives you information on what mycotoxins are of that prevalent risk. And there's a couple things you want to consider there as well. What's the actual toxin and what's its level potentially in your feed? So whether it's aflatoxin, T2, DON, ochratoxin, or others, you want to look at the rate of that toxin and the entire panel. Are you having low levels of multiple toxins or high level of one specific toxin? And then you want to also make it into that bird level. What's the value the birds are producing? Certain birds at certain ages are able to be more tolerant of different mycotoxins or different mycotoxin loads. We see a little bit more severity in chicks, animals that are really growing rapidly and going into adulthood because they're trying to manage the maintenance of their own tissues, but also the rapid deposition and growth of new tissues and production. That changes a little bit for adult broilers and or layers, but at the same time, certain toxins can have disproportionate effects on breeding stock or inlay. And so we want to make sure that we're taking all of these into effect when we start getting into rates. Generally speaking, for a product like IntegraFlo, we look at 2 pounds per ton or 1 kg per metric ton as some of the baseline rate of product usage. And that gives you a kind of low level of protection against a myriad of mycotoxins within a traditional feed matrix that we end up seeing. As we get into some of those more applied either moderate loads or specific toxins, typically more polar toxins are going to have higher binding efficiency to a clay-based product, which means things like aflatoxin or T2, we're able to have a little bit more direct impact and require less product. Whereas something like an ochratoxin or a fumonisin being nonpolar are going to be requiring more, closer to 6 or even 8 pounds if it's a significant challenge. The higher the rate, allows us to, one, have more binding capacity in the feed, and two, just facilitate that contact so that we have enough product in there to where it can mix and bind across all toxins within that feed matrix. And in order to test some of that, in our research facilities, we exposed poultry to, in this case, broilers, to a myriad of mildly contaminated feed that was analyzed to have confirmed mycotoxin loads. That included primarily zearalenone and T2 toxin, as well as small amounts of vomitoxin and aflatoxin. Again, this is somewhat representative of what we start seeing in the field, where you may have one primary mycotoxin, but more often than not, it's 2 or 3 toxins. Additionally, looking at the feed matrix, this was a corn soy diet, but as you get into things with DDGs as a very concentrated source of corn, you can sometimes see very high areas of mycotoxin challenge. In this study, we did a dose response between 0 and 8 pounds per ton of IntegraFlo at 2-pound increments. And what we found were kind of linear results with feed intake and gain. So really one of the goals when we start looking at mycotoxin mitigation is to just maintain normal behaviors. When birds are exposed to toxins and they start degrading parts of their body or they're in the feed, we often see some depression within feed intake. Here, we don't have a significant finding, but we do have a p-value of 0.11 and a linear response with daily feed intake. And that increases as we increase the proportion of IntegraFlo in the feed from 0 up to 8 pounds. The reason we care about feed intake is we have a proportional increase in average body weight, and this is statistically significant. So as we increase the application, and this is again in a known challenge scenario and in a continuous application, we see that increase in body weight up to 8 pounds, in this case, delivering the greatest result. And these are all day 21 with the trial taken to day 28. And so what we end up seeing is that increase in load is able to be mitigated by a binder. We're able to better utilize feed intake of those birds and those normal patterns and turn that feed into gain. That said, we don't always see this continuous application of mycotoxin challenge within a flock. And so it is important to, again, kind of match those rates in prevention, where it sometimes does ebb and flow to where you don't need 5, 6, 7, 8 pounds of a mitigation control in there at all times. More realistically, we're going to be seeing spikes of mild to moderate contamination within a finished feed. So when we look at IntegraFlo as one option, we can maintain feed intake, we can get binding of specific mycotoxins and ultimately contribute to increased performance and or gain. And the binding efficiency is what we see in some of these graphics to the right. And again, it's going to be somewhat dependent on the actual toxin. So our binding efficiency for aflatoxin is very high, meaning that with only 2 pounds of product, we can bind a high degree of aflatoxin and it stays bound, whereas something like ochratoxin we have less efficacy at and require higher product concentrations. And that's ultimately going to affect what toxin you're going after and what product is best suited for your specific need. There are other binding agents. You sell wall derivatives as an organic binder that has high absorptive capacity for certain toxins as well, T2, DONS, or alanine. And then you have your silicates, which are inorganic binders and have high absorptive capacity, again, for more polar toxins, especially things like aflatoxin. In our scenario, we have products that are both organic and conventionally listed. So organic being listed through OMRI and adhering to National Organic Program standards. And the last differentiator is with IntegraFlo, we actually have additional vitamins within that product that are specifically selected to handle some of those pathways that are activated during the mycotoxin challenge. So we want to directly address the challenge itself, and that's what the binding capacity of those silicates does, actually binding and trying to hold on to the toxin so it can be passed out through the gastrointestinal tract. However, any that slip by are going to trigger different inflammatory pathways, oxidative stress pathways, and we have vitamins within that mix that are specifically selected to help overcome the activation of those pathways and not divert some of your more traditional resources into those to help protect the bird. So it's one thing to compare and contrast mycotoxin binders, and that's what commonly happens, but there's a couple things that we want to look at. One is specificity. So as we mentioned before, you have a couple different treatment scenarios, and it's important to be able to match products to those scenarios. So for example, we have IntegraFlo maybe giving broader activity and protection than a mycotoxin degrading enzyme. In our research barns, we looked at the potential of combo products and evaluation of a mycotoxin degrading enzyme. And in the starter phase, which is where we saw the most contrast and statistical significance, the main effects supported IntegraFlo over the enzyme. We have, again, those green bars representing body weight, feed conversion being the yellow checkered bars to the right. And when the IntegraFlo is administered compared to an untreated period or all of the remaining treatment groups, we see a significant decrease in feed conversion ratio. which means those birds are more efficient, and we see the maintenance and a slight numerical increase in body weight. When we look at the main effects of enzyme versus no enzyme or an untreated group, we see that the results are not statistically significant, nor are they really numerically different for feed conversion or body weight gain. That said, in some of these models, we're again seeing multiple different mycotoxins within that final feed matrix. Which is why when we put them together, we can actually see some greater benefit. These are the same data points, but at the end. And so what we see is an untreated control that is exposed to some of those mycotoxins, and the body weight at termination was 2.64 kilos. The enzyme group was 2.68, IntegraFlo 2.69, but then the combination being 2.72. Pretty much across the board, with the exception of some of that starter feed conversion, the untreated group was the lowest. And so when we start looking at what that differentiation actually looks like, the untreated is going to be facilitating that negative performance response. We see depression in feed intake, depression in body weight gain, and suboptimal feed conversion. As we start moving into that enzyme and IntegraFlo, we see that uptake in feed intake, uptake corresponding in gain. But where we really saw the greatest value was using them both together. So increasing body weight to 5.995 kilos. That's pounds in this graphic. So we're getting, compared to the untreated control, an extra almost 0.2 pounds out of the combined application. We're also further reducing feed conversion, and that's lower than both the untreated control and the enzyme or IntegraFlo on its own in the starter. So what we're able to end up doing is create potential synergies where we're overlapping these mechanisms. If there's a specific mycotoxin challenge that you have that has to be addressed, there are things like enzymes that can be used effectively. That doesn't mean that other products or other solutions don't have to be part of that program. We can actually see some potential synergies or areas where they work very well together to implement kind of a low-cost alternative such as IntegraFlo into that program and enhance the spectrum of coverage that you see within your feed matrix. So what are the key takeaways? Well, we know that mycotoxins are a tough threat to really evaluate and look at because they occur at low levels. And so it becomes really important to have a proactive and preventative action to protect your flock health and performance. These mycotoxins occur on damaged and moldy corn that is potentially stored improperly or through drought or stress conditions in the field. And it's those secondary metabolites and toxins that when they enter the bird create damage within multiple aspects and ultimately steal from our performance potential. It's first important for all producers to understand where's that risk coming from and what you can do about it. What's your local corn quality looking like? How are you sourcing your corn? What are you using in that diet? If you're using a high proportion of corn and DDGs, then your risk for mycotoxins is much greater than someone who's using some lower risk commodities. We see some mycotoxin levels in soybean meal, for example, but not even close to what we see in corn. And then DDGs oftentimes, again, being a concentration of those corn mycotoxins. You really want to validate your risk through testing as much as is practical within your operation. So for receiving corn, for finished feeds, for individual ingredients, and doing that testing correctly, as Aaliyah mentioned, training on how to sample correctly, how to run those tests, and making sure that you can actually trust the numbers and that it makes sense. From there, you want to look at the birds themselves. What's the age of the flock that you're working with? What's the breed of the flock you're working with? What type of production parameters? Are there other risks? Do you have caged layers that have minimal other risks involved? Or are you dealing with a maybe organic and cage-free setup to where microbial challenge load is often a little bit higher? They're exposed to more environmental stress, parasites, and other things, to where you could have the exact same level of contamination and disease within a flock, but mycotoxins make it that much worse. Whereas a low stress environment, mycotoxins could be more easily handled through the bird. And that's going to ultimately inform where you go from there. What's the best mitigation strategy for you, both in terms of efficacy and cost? And with that, we would love to hear any additional questions that you have. There's one or two that kind of came through during the presentation that we'll answer, but if any others come up, please let us know in the chat. Additionally, feel free to reach out by email at our emails below, Aaliyah Gelati or myself, Tim Broderick at ralcoagriculture.com.
Thanks. Yeah, if y'all have any questions, please feel free to drop them. For now, I'll start with one that we got regarding, and this is something we did briefly address, but should my mitigation strategy change between the starter, grower, and finisher diets? Tim, do you want to take the lead on that? I mean, I can give a pretty simple answer, but I know it's similar to a question we got in the last one, and I think you did a pretty good job answering that.
Sure. So I just kind of touched on it in the summary. But when we look at the risk of those birds, as you get earlier in production, the bird is going through a lot more changes and a lot more development. And that means that even if the risk or the level of mycotoxin remains proportionally the same, the effect that it has is much worse on those younger birds. So we saw that in the data. We saw some of those starter differentiations be a little bit more contrasting than what we see a little bit later. And that's because when those birds are placed, they have a naive gut. They're not really developed. They have a naive immune system. It's just like people when they're born. There's not a whole lot there. We as humans get the benefit of kind of milk and colostrum and support. These chicks get tossed onto the floor with 10, 20, 30,000 of their best friends, and they're going through all these new things together. And so when they're young, all that development really has to take place, and they're exposed to a lot of these secondary stressors just as a natural part of placement. And that's where early mycotoxin challenges can be exacerbated a little bit more than what we see in a full-grown or adult species.
Awesome. I have one here. How would you say the management of mycotoxin differs between a conventional or a cage-free, and I'm assuming organic operation? Kind of how do those strategies differ, if at all, I would say, is what they're saying.
For me, it's again part of risk-based assessment. So when we look at the actual implementation of the product within a cage-free versus a caged system, when you look at a caged system, your microbial stress is much lower. Usually you have pretty good environmental controls depending on the location of those facilities, but you don't have as many secondary challenges. We can really have a fairly minimal baseline health program, and those birds can perform very well. That said, when we get into a cage-free system, we start seeing IntegraFlo help mitigate mycotoxins as part of that larger picture. And so we sometimes see flocks, especially in like organic production, have some challenges simply because they're exposed to 5 different types of challenge. And anything we can do to shut off some of those pathways is going to be beneficial, because with organic flocks, those birds are still going to be on the floor. They're going to be out of a caged environment. They're going to be exposed to more parasite load. They're going to be exposed to higher microbial load. So if we can just check off mycotoxins from that list, we're going to have a higher health status within that flock. Just saw some come in on the product for use in sows and kind of temperature. So great questions. It can be used across different livestock species. If you want to reach out, we do have a swine technical team, and they do have research in its use within sows. So they have specific trials and information that could be helpful there. The other part of that question, and it's a really good one, is resisting high temperatures. So temperature, especially if you're doing pelleting, we do have the ability to resist any type of pelleting and conditioning conditions, as well as storage. So we haven't seen any concerns with that product. The way that some of those clays and silicates work, we're able to withstand any type of processing conditions. And additionally, the other part of that is on the vitamin side. And so there are going to be some storage capacities just to maintain the freshness of that vitamin. But within a year to year and a half, we're still see pretty good recovery due to the high level and the protective natures that we have on some of those vitamins.
I have one here. Are any kind of feed additives or do mycotoxins affect the effectiveness of feed additives? Sorry, reading is not my strong suit right now. Do mycotoxins affect the capability of feed additives to function properly, such as probiotics, prebiotics, antibiotics, and things like that? So, are mycotoxins affecting feed additives?
That is a great question. So mycotoxins themselves shouldn't really directly interfere that much with any other alternative feed stuff. So if you're putting a prebiotic isn't going to get damaged per se by a mycotoxin. That said, without any type of mitigation agent, are you getting the maximal value of certain other additives? The broader question really for me kind of comes up with things like yeasts, because yeast can have some binding activity with mycotoxins, which is great. When we look at it, are yeast necessarily there just to support the mycotoxin challenge? Not necessarily. So it depends what you have it in for. If you have that type of a product in to deal with mycotoxins, then your efficacy should be there. If you have that type of a product in for salmonella binding, or you have that product in for immunomodulation or other properties, then it could be derailed by its activity against uh, mycotoxins, which is still beneficial. The other thing is when we look at things like essential oils, they have great antioxidant properties. Mycotoxins simply bring in oxidative stress as some of their pathways. So it's not reducing the efficacy of that product. That product is now being used, but we can more cheaply circumvent that challenge with kind of clay binders or other mitigation strategies compared to using just, an essential oil, which is oftentimes a more moderate to a higher cost product within the feed matrix.
Yeah, I think another piece of that also is just if you're seeing mycotoxin damage within the bird and you're adding something for health benefits, it's kind of, more or less evening out. So, are we really making use of the money that we're spending on that health additive if we're having mycotoxins come in and just completely, destroy everything that we've just built within that gut? So making sure that we're getting, making, our money's worth per se of products and, having something in there to combat mycotoxins can, at the end of the day, help your other additives function better because they're now able to spend all that energy on uplift while, if you have a mycotoxin challenge and your probiotics are in there, for example, they're trying to work and at the you'll likely just be able to see, if anything, a pretty stable performance because while it's helping, you're also getting a decrease in performance from the mycotoxins. So just making sure that's being managed well will affect, how much money you're spending on certain additives and space in the diet, quite frankly.
All right. So if anyone else has any questions, feel free to send them. Otherwise, our contact information is on the screen. You can reach out with any time with either product information, general questions, or just information you need about mycotoxin challenges to help your producers or your flocks.
Thank you all again for being here with us.